Thank you very much. I don't think for anybody in this room I really need to spend much time on the introduction of this incredible woman sitting next to me, but for the purposes of protocol, I'm looking at her bio right now, and it starts with Pulitzer Prize winner, but I'm going to start with Mississippian and Pulitzer Prize winner, Natasha Trethewey. Served 2 terms as the 19th Poet Laureate of the United States, 2012 to 2014, while also serving as the Poet Laureate of the state of Mississippi, 2012 to 2016. She's the author of the New York Times bestseller, Memorial Drive, a daughter's memoir, a book of nonfiction, Beyond Katrina, a meditation on the Mississippi Gulf Coast, and 5 collections of poetry, Monument, Poems, New and Selected, which was longlisted for the 2018 National Book Award, Thrall in 2012, Native Guard in 2006, for which she was awarded the Pulitzer Prize, Belloc Ophelia in 2002, and Domestic Work in 2000. And now she has graced us with this beautiful book, The House of Being, which we're here to talk about today. Always great to spend a little bit of time with my friend, the incredible Natasha Trethewey. Let's give her a round of applause.
Thank you.
All right, let's jump into it. Now, Natasha, your latest book, The House of Being, was first delivered, some of you may know this, as a lecture at Yale in 2022. In that way, I mentioned to you that it reminds me a little bit of Welty in One Writer's Beginnings, which was delivered as a series of lectures at Harvard, which, by the way, if you don't know this, you can listen to her actual lectures at Harvard. I think it's on Audible now. So you can hear Eudora Welty give what becomes One Writer's Beginnings. And now I've had the chance to both hear Natasha give this as a lecture at the Eudora Welty Lecture in Washington, D.C. this past year, and to get a chance to read this wonderful book. So just by way of beginning, would you tell us how you would describe the House of Being and maybe read a little bit for us?
Yeah, happy to. So the series that I gave this lecture in is the Wyndham Campbell lectures, and they always ask the writers to do the same thing, to answer the same question, why I write. And for me, I had sort of written this narrative of why I write many times before. A lecture I gave back in, I think 2008 was the first time I addressed the topic. And then my memoir, Memorial Drive, in many ways is very much about why I write, the thing that drove me to have to write. So I had to do it again, and I needed to say something different or find a different way to say it, even though the reasons stay the same, the obsessions stay the same. They've always been. So it really is just a meditation on that. And in it, I consider the role of place, one's native pastures, the need to tell one's own story, to push back against received knowledge, and to create a monument in words. So I'm going to read the very first, very short chapter so you can get a sense of how the book begins. It's divided into 4 sections. The first section is called The World Book. The second is Crossroads. The third is The House of Being, and 4, Native Pastures. 1, The World Book. The first collection of books I ever encountered filled the shelves of the tall bookcase at the back of my grandmother's house. It stood just inside the doorway to the den at the end of a long hallway. From floor to ceiling was an assortment of novels and plays, history, philosophy, and mythology from my parents' university years, a set of classic children's stories in several volumes, etiquette books, a group of pamphlets from the 50s about the proper dress and comportment of young ladies, an abridged dictionary, and the 20-volume World Book Encyclopedia, 1966. Bought for the year I was born, the set was meant to be commemorative, marking the beginning of my journey toward knowledge. My grandmother had purchased the set after nearly a year of saving the S&H green stamp she received with each purchase at the grocery store. There had been other gifts to choose from, I was told, including bronzed baby shoes or a set of creamy white dishes embellished with a border of pink roses and leaves. But my mother had insisted on the encyclopedia. Pristine and stiff-spined, the set occupied an entire shelf of the bookcase. As soon as I was able to reach the volumes, I'd pull one down to look at the photographs inside, the pages crisp and glossy. That the story of the World Book's provenance was passed down to me from the beginning made it even more prized. I was enthralled with the title, the idea that a set of books could contain even a single year of the world beyond our house. The thought of what awaited me there ignited a longing that followed me even into sleep as I listened to my father's voice reciting a bedtime story, the myth of Odysseus and his many trials that I was certain that my father had found among the pages in the many books on those shelves. Our nightly ritual of stories from classical mythology was only part of the means by which my father meant to reveal the world to me. To prepare me for it, and for the inevitable trials to come, he was determined that I have an early understanding of the metaphorical nature of language. During the day, the natural world served as our classroom. Most afternoons we took long walks during which I'd pick wildflowers for my mother, and he would recite poetry. All along the way, he'd point out the flora and fauna we encountered, the vivid imagery inscribed in so many of the names: red-winged blackbird with its bright slash of feathers, mockingbird mimicking another bird's song, the word daisy, which he repeated again and again, altering it just so until I heard in the syllables of that single word two distinct ones: days-eye. He had been holding the flower aloft, and suddenly I could see the way it mimicked the sun, each white petal a ray of light, the yellow disk at its center, our day's bright eye. On those afternoons, long before I could read, I heard Yeats's Sailing to Byzantium, Robert Hayden's Those Winter Sundays, Wordsworth's lines composed a few miles above Tintern Abbey, even the epic poem Beowulf, first in Old English, then in translation, all in the cadences of my father's resonant voice. And though I could not always grasp at first their meanings, I trembled with excitement at the sounds. An aged man is but a paltry thing, a tattered coat upon a stick, unless soul clap its hands and sing and louder sing for every tatter in its mortal dress. Occasionally, my father would pause to explain a word, an image, the metaphor therein. Most often it was something he could illustrate with the things around us, on the roadside, evidence of its difficult crossing, the cracked shell of an old turtle, its tattered mortal dress. I carry with me still a dream of that time, the earliest I can remember from my childhood. I am standing in the hall outside the room I share with my parents, my crib beneath the window next to their bed. It is night, and the house is so quiet it seems that I am alone, or that everyone else is sleeping. The long hallway before me is a cave tunneling through the darkness, the bookcase, I can just make it out, at its opposite end. And there, standing in the doorway, blocking it, is a figure the shape of a man made entirely of the crushed oyster shells, white and sharp-edged, that form the driveway beside our house. It's a familiar scene, archetypal in its imagery, which is why I think it has stayed with me. I must have been only 3 years old when I had the dream, and so the contents of all those books were as yet unavailable to me. What had the dream meant back then? It's a question I've been trying to answer ever since, because the imagery of dreams is figurative, metaphorical as all language is. It's easy to apply meaning over the course of one's life, to make sense of not only the past, but also the present. I can't recall whether I had the dream on a night just after my father recited the story of Odysseus, the Cyclops, and the cave, but I can hear the echoes between them, how the hero of the story, on her quest, must get past the obstacle blocking her path to the world. When I think back on it now, I can see that all the stories my father told me, each with some form of the hero's journey, must have taken root in my psyche, establishing early on the pattern to which my own journey would conform. If the message I learned then from the experience of Odysseus was that it would take cleverness to outpace whatever obstacles stood before me. The meaning of the dream would deepen over the years as I came to see it as a metaphor rooted not only within the classical tradition of Greek mythology, but also a vernacular tradition, the quest for knowledge, for literacy in slave narratives that was equated with personhood, citizenship, the ability to escape. That the obstacle in my dream was made of oyster shells, the indigenous materials of my native geography, is also telling. Location, wrote Eudora Welty, is the crossroads of circumstance. Even in the dream, I knew the World Book was there, waiting for me. I needed only to get to it.
Okay, there's a lot to unpack in that little bit, but I'm so glad that you started there and with the World Book, because I'm interested in really what that meant to you. Also, this tension throughout the book as you talk about between the classical monumental versus the vernacular, and I hope we'll explore that some more. But really first with the World Book, what it meant and how you come back to it later in the book, realizing at some point that you say that books are much more than just repositories of knowledge. And particularly how the 1966 World Book took you on as a child an investigation of what it described pretty emphatically as what were the races of the world. And how eventually you knew, quote, something was wrong, but I had not yet fully rejected it, had not yet begun to resist the calcified manifestations of received knowledge, even as I was already on a journey towards self-knowledge. Knowledge based not only in experience, but also in the cultivation of the intellect. Wondering if you could talk about that and what the World Book meant to you and your grappling with that knowledge and those two things of vernacular and monumental.
Yeah, oh, that's great. Let me start with the title of this book, because I think that it really illustrates this problem of knowledge and the places that knowledge comes from. I struggled with naming this book The House of Being because of where it comes from. My father used to quote the German philosopher Heidegger. The quote was, "Language is the house of being." And it's beautiful. It's true. We find our way in language. We come into the world in language. But Heidegger was also a Nazi. And I thought, if I name this book that, someone is going to think that I'm just, not even thinking about that part and just naming this book. But I do get a chance to sort of talk about, and it became the way to really get at the issue with the World Book. I was someone who was so in love with books, with reading, that they just seemed always this amazing, wonderful resource. And I hadn't yet begun to realize that also the things that I might read were going to tell me something about how I would be perceived by the world across time and space throughout history. My father and I would argue about Thomas Jefferson as I got older, because, on the one hand, yes, Jefferson, the Enlightenment, all these wonderful things, but it was also Enlightenment philosophers that first began to codify ideas of race and difference and racial hierarchy, the bedrocks of our sort of ongoing contemporary forms of white supremacy. And so this World Book that they bought for me, that I spent hours trying to read, every entry. One summer I thought I would teach myself Greek by learning the Greek alphabet. I mean, I went to this book for everything. And then one day, the section on races of man. And even though by 1966 they were a little bit better, if you check your encyclopedias over time, it's across many decades, you'll see how that thinking about race was changing. And yet there were ways that the encyclopedia still presented this sort of racial hierarchy. Even if the words didn't quite say it, the imagery and the positions on the pages themselves. One of the things that I particularly noticed was that the they showed the different races, and they were Caucasoid, Negroid, and Mongoloid. And the Caucasoid was represented by the head of a bust of a man that looked like he had been carved out of Parian marble, you know, the whitest, purest looking marble. But if you looked at the Negroid representation, it was almost a specimen. It was rendered sort of as a photograph, you know, something that you might see. It sort of also reminded me of those images that were taken by, was it Agassiz, of the slaves in South Carolina, and the kind of way that people would just sort of stare blankly, almost knowing that they were sort of being taken in this way, this kind of representation. So, you know, there were also things about this idea of, you know, physiognomy, that if you were one race, you were, your leg was longer from the hip to the knee, or the knee to the ankle. And so I remember reading that and sneaking into my grandmother's tape workroom to get out her tape measure and measure, because I thought, oh, okay, so this is telling me what I am. And, you know, having been born in Mississippi when miscegenation was still illegal, on Confederate Memorial Day, exactly 100 years to the day that that holiday was first celebrated in the state of Mississippi, I wanted to know. And it didn't tell me anything except, you're here. And I'm going to stop, but I will say, so much around me in Mississippi was telling me, you are here. Monuments, flags, all sorts of things. You know what they are.
And also in that passage, the here, the place is really important, and clearly place is central in the theme of this entire book. The memory of place, the language you use to describe place are really important. It's about where you are geographically, yes, but also what that geography means, what that place actually means. And in this description of your grandmother's house and where it's located, the actual place of it is very important. At the crossroads, which is a word that comes up repeatedly here as well, the crossroads of Highway 49 and Jefferson Street. Can you tell us about your grandmother's house and that place and what that means?
Yes, so to go back to wanting to find a new way to talk about why I write, I decided to go back to my grandmother's house. This was the place, this is the first site of my sort of burgeoning knowledge of self and the world. My grandmother's house sits at the intersection. It was an intersection during my childhood for a while, at the crossroads intersection between Highway 49, legendary Highway of the Blues, and Jefferson Street. Before I was born, during my mother's childhood, and when my grandmother was also a child there was a pasture. My great aunt and uncle lived on the other side of the pasture. So that's also where the idea of native pastures comes into the book as well. Because there that pasture was, but you know, as often happens, they built a highway right through this black community. And so now we were divided by this road that got bigger and bigger. But right there, at that intersection, you know, I talk a lot about the naming of the roads. So in Gulfport, the east-west ones are named for like states, and the north-south ones are named for presidents, or maybe I got that backwards, but that's how they go. So she was at Jefferson. So the little white concrete marker, little sort of like an obelisk, was right there in front of my grandmother's house. And so that kind of contradiction to me was interesting, that, you know, this thing that looked like a classical monument with Jefferson's name on it was right in front of her house. And that house was a crossroads also because my parents' interracial marriage, this is the first house I entered, you know, the day after Confederate Memorial Day when I came home from the hospital. So there was the crossroads of that interracial marriage. And my grandmother's house, of course, was a shotgun house. A shotgun house that she had actually built a second part to, so it sort of became double. But originally a shotgun house, of course, which is, scholars believe comes from West Africa, brought to New Orleans by people who immigrated there. And so that idea of Eudora Welty's location is the crossroads of circumstance, or another one that I use in the book, Ralph Ellison's revision of Heraclitus's axiom that character is fate to geography is fate. And so it's as if being born at that crossroads was a kind of fate for me. It was everything that I would sort of come to think about the world. It became a lens through which to understand myself, my place in the world.
I'm deeply moved by your description of the crossroads in relation to how you talk about your grandmother, and particularly her great craftsmanship when it came to sewing and finding yourself thinking about the skills that she possessed, and what you say was the embodiment of a figurative vernacular tradition at your grandmother's house, and how that's juxtaposed with your father in particular and his emphasis on the King's English. And I'm wondering if you could talk about that crossroad and the meaning of your grandmother here.
Yes, I think that if I could find where I say this thing, because I feel like I write it better than I might try to answer it. Yeah. Oh, here it is. So, listening to my grandmother and acquiring both languages, I was learning the power in the ability to code switch, but I was also learning a hierarchy too. Though my father wanted to rid me fully of Black English, I resisted. As a child, I knew only that because I loved the people who spoke it, I was not willing to give up the language that connected us across time and space. I was not willing to give up what I had learned studying my grandmother. So again, it's the way that the classical, the King's English meets the vernacular. And I understood, why my father would want me to only speak the King's English, because, there was that hierarchy. There might be a disadvantage to someone who can't speak both languages. But it doesn't mean that you have to give up that language, because also that language, I think, is the source. Black English for me was the source of so much metaphor and idiom. It was also a source of, I think even now, the cadences that I find beneath my own work. I think I had, obviously different cadences, a different kind of music to think about than my white father. But I knew that cadence too, but I found something richer for my own use in my real native language.
And a poignant point in the book of your white father, but who on your birth certificate has to be listed as Canadian,
right?
Instead of white, as if that's an ethnicity because of the illegal nature of miscegenation in Mississippi at that time, right?
So right, they could not write that on the birth certificate.
Wow.
Yeah. And I'm sorry.
No.
Yeah, there's a part where I'm talking about the way that a birth certificate is the first official document of a life. I mean, that is the first time something is really written down about who you are. And already on that document, the narrative is, and the received knowledge that's embedded in that is already troubling. Already the kind of thing that I'm going to have to push back against, the obstacles that on my hero's journey I'll have to best.
Let's jump into this question about why you write, because I think that really is at the heart of this book. There's a wonderful quote here in the book that also makes its way onto the dust jacket. The act of writing is the way to create another world and language, a dwelling place for the psyche wherein the chaos of the external world is transformed, shaped into a made thing and ordered. It's an act of reclamation and resistance. The soul sings for justice, and the song is poetry. Tell us about your work of both reclamation and resistance and what you mean here.
Well, so, I mean, some of it is what I've been talking about already, and that is a way to be the sovereign of the self, to take ownership of the narrative of the self, rather than the stories that would be told about me, to me, by textbooks, teachers, monuments, roads, bridges, flags, all the things that were telling me that I had a kind of second-class citizenship. So reclaiming first my own story, my own metaphors, was one of the reasons that I found it necessary to write, to push back against all of those things that meant to define me in someone else's lens. One of the quotes I use is a really good one to illustrate this. This is Thomas Jefferson from Notes on the State of Virginia. Among the blacks is misery enough, God knows, but no poetry. So I'm going to have to write poetry, you know? I'm going to have to push back against all of that received knowledge. Also, on a, that's sort of I think sort of a larger, but in the small way too, having to push back against the received knowledge of the household that I was growing up in Atlanta. And this was, in many ways the subject of Memorial Drive. The years of living with my mother's second husband before she divorced him and escaped this sort of decade of domestic violence. And the kind of psychological abuse that I faced because of that stepfather. I needed also to try to take control of the things that, in language, that I couldn't be in control of when I was a child and they were happening. The chaos of that. But to write about it, to tell the story yourself, to make a poem out of it, to make something beautiful out of it. Percy Bysshe Shelley writes that poetry is the mirror that makes beautiful that which is distorted. So even the worst thing, even the chaos, can be transformed into this made thing, and you can own it in a way that it won't destroy you.
This act of reclamation and resistance, it comes up in different ways throughout the book and in different aspects of your life. And I want to dive into some of those. You also mentioned this great quote that you have in here about, not great, but this quote by Thomas Jefferson, Black Americans have no poetry, but at the same time you use that to juxtapose it with Robert Johnson and Big John Williams and the blues. And so it doesn't, that quote from Jefferson doesn't exist in a vacuum in the book.
Y'all know how to signify, right?
That's right. That's right. And you make this really, I think, beautiful point, especially about Robert Johnson and this, the myth, right, that he sold his soul to the devil at the crossroads, this word, the crossroads, right? But that myth erases the brilliance and skill of Robert Johnson. It's like he was just given it, right? He didn't earn it. And so, what is that work of reclamation and resistance that you're doing there in that part, since you brought up this Thomas Jefferson quote?
Well, I'm glad you brought that one up, because that is about, trying to signify, because I think that I have also been told those kinds of things about my own ability. I mean, I've actually had people who, sort of feel like, because I am very autobiographical as a poet, that that doesn't take any artfulness, because you're just actually writing about what happened to you. As if you just are given that, then you're not doing anything to make it something, to make it into a work of art. I just want to read this Lucille Clifton poem here, though, because I think
Absolutely.
that this is in the section where I'm talking about, like, watching my grandmother and listening to her at her sewing machine, learning all of the real skill that she brought to her work, her art. This poem is great. It also reminds me, because my grandmother, one year, we were watching television, and I think it must have been when Trent Lott said, oh, bless you, yeah. I think he said something about, things would be a lot different, better in his mind if Strom Thurmond had, you remember the quote I'm talking about? Okay, so I'm watching this with my grandmother, and I guess Trent Lott's kind of in the hot seat about this or whatever, and my grandmother looks and just kind of says, I made his draperies. So anyway, there was a lot of signifying going on in just those words. So this is Lucille Clifton's Study the Masters. Like my Aunt Timmy, it was her iron, or one like hers, that smoothed the sheets the master poet slept on. Home or hotel, what matters is he lay himself down on her handiwork and dreamed. She dreamed too. Words, some Cherokee, some Maasai, and some huge and particular as hope. If you had heard her chanting as she ironed, you would understand form and line and discipline and order and America.
Since you brought up Lucille Clifton, you also address Audre Lorde here. And interestingly, you challenge something Audre Lorde famously says, that the master's tools cannot dismantle the master's house. And yet, you in your own work find a way to do that in your writing. I'm wondering if you could talk about that.
Well, I think when she says the master's tools, she means the master's tools of oppression,
Right.
All of those tools, not the other tools that some people think only belong to the masters, which are writing a sonnet, for example, those kinds of tools. And so, to me, to be able to take a form like the sonnet and to use it in the service of saying something that challenges the very idea of who that belongs to is another one of those sort of not only reclamation but resistance, and I think signifying.
In terms of signifying, and also to bring up your mother and the remarkable impact her life and experience had on you, I think my favorite passage of the book is when you describe how she would sing the anti-slavery abolitionist version of the Battle Hymn of the Republic every time you drove by the old Mississippi state flag. Tell us about that experience and what your mother was doing and what that meant to you.
Yeah, so on Highway 90 in Gulfport, the 8 flags, so not only that Mississippi flag, but the Confederate flag still flew there as well. And so my mother was, trying to counteract the messages that those flags were giving to us, as Black Americans. And this is the kind of thing that the scholar I'm losing his name, Jarvis, did you write it? Well, you'll see it in the book, but he calls it a fugitive pedagogy.
Yeah.
So there are other ways that you get sort of this a pedagogy that is going against the kinds of things that you might learn in school, see in your textbooks. You know, in my book, Native Guard, I have a poem about, it's called Southern History, and it's about the textbook that I had in my senior year in high school that said things like, you know, the slaves were better off under a master's care, they were clothed and well fed. This was sort of the stuff that we were all being taught in school. And so my mother had these ways of counteracting with a kind of fugitive pedagogy, something else that I needed to know to be able to push back against those narratives that I was getting in all of the most learned places.
You talk at length about the sovereign of the self and what that means as an act of reclamation. Can you explain to us what you're talking about?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's, again, sort of what I've been talking about. If you don't tell your own story, someone is going to tell it for you. Someone is going to say who you are, where you belong, where you don't belong, what your prospects in life are. Everything will be defined for you. You have to be able to tell that story. And I think in being able to tell that story is being the sovereign of the self. Because you think about it, you know, you are made up of all of the things that have happened to you across your lifetime. But you decide which story to tell about those things. If someone else were going to tell my story, for example, and this is the reason that I wrote Memorial Drive, because people started talking about my mother as in my backstory as just this victim, this murdered woman. She was always presented as an afterthought and not the person that she was. If you meet someone who says, and people often say this to me, particularly after reading that book, which is bizarre to me, they're like, I would not want to have your life. And I'm like, really? You wouldn't? Huh. Because what life are they thinking of? That's not the story that I tell about my life. You can tell a story about your life that is the trauma, and maybe it has destroyed you in some ways, or you can tell a story of resilience and hope and joy. That's the story I tell about my life.
I'm so glad you said that, because I think all of us in this room have been moved by and you know, felt deep empathy over the tragedy of the loss of your mother. But if you read Memorial Drive and if you read this book, it's not about her death. It's about her life and what she meant to you. There's a beauty in the story of her life and in your grandmother's life and what their lives meant to you. The significance of death and loss is obvious, yes, that's there. But really, it's so much more than that. And you describe it as your, quote, duty at one point to write about them so as that they're not to be forgotten. And I'm just hoping you could say something about that, and you're going to make me cry up here, but.
When I first started thinking that I was going to become a poet and I started writing poems, I actually began with my grandmother and my grandmother's house, which is why this book, going back there, makes sense. I not only listened to my grandmother, but also the stories of the elders in that community. And by the time I was in graduate school and beginning to write poems, what I was realizing is that these people were dying. I was losing, these elders who had raised me all those years. And I wanted to hold on to them. I wanted their stories to stay relevant, not only to me, but to the world that I thought needed to know about those people. So in my first book, Domestic Work, I started writing those stories. I started trying to record that. And of course, and make a monument to that world and to those people who had made me. And that continued, of course, when I wrote about my mother, to try to create something that would last longer than, even a stone monument. That as long as she might be remembered or thought of or exist in the mind of someone who might read my books, she's not really gone. I mention in this book a poem I was trying to write early on that it just never ended up being successful. Perhaps I wasn't, and I think what I say is because I wasn't really allowing myself to see what I was asking. But the poem was about the nature of permanence and impermanence, and this also goes back to the location and that house, because my grandmother's shotgun house, as I mentioned, was one of the houses that just was up on cinder blocks. You could just see under the house. And so when I was a kid, I could crawl under there, and I just remember thinking that because one morning after a particularly heavy storm, I opened the back door, and there were three concrete steps that went up to my grandmother's back door. And the water in her yard was all the way up to the steps. So basically it looked like the house was floating because you couldn't see the cinder blocks anymore. And it made me think that that there was nothing tying it there, that it could just float away, out into the Gulf. And so what I wanted to do was to build something that couldn't just be destroyed or float away.
Thank you. That also lends us to a conversation and discussion of your classic book of poetry, Native Guard, and what you were doing there. You could say here in the House of Being that I can see now that this has always been one of my impulses, to remember to make a container for the vanished past, the forgotten or erased. Tell us a little bit about what this meant in the context of Native Guard and the stories of those Black American soldiers at Fort Massachusetts on Ship Island.
So some of you may know this, that if you've read any of those, but when I came back from Atlanta, I spent every summer with my grandmother. And one of the things that we would do would be to go out to Ship Island every 4th of July and, take the tour of the fort. And at that point, on all those times that we went there, the park ranger never mentioned anything about the Black soldiers who had been stationed on Ship Island. And so this wasn't a story that I knew. And I just think, or that a lot of people knew. Even, Mississippians don't necessarily know this. And so, you think about what might be different if all of us knew the full measure of our history and not the part that, gets inscribed, by trying to glorify the Confederacy and white supremacy. And so I only found out by accident because I was with my grandmother on the beach at Whitecap restaurant before it washed away in Katrina. But anyway, we were having lunch, and I was in my first year of a teaching job in Alabama, and I was telling my grandmother about this assignment that I was going to give my students, where you get them to write about a time someone in their family met somebody famous. A lot of us have stories like that. There was a story in my own family that my grandmother had told me, and so I was telling her that I was going to do this same exercise. And that my grandmother told me that her brother, my great uncle Hubert, had worked as a bellhop at a hotel on the beach in Biloxi, and he shook Al Capone's hand. And so Al Capone used to come down to the coast to hold these offshore gambling parties. My grandmother, I think, got the place wrong and thought that it was on Ship Island and not the Isle of Capri that sort of is no longer. So I'm just talking about this, and this woman who's been eavesdropping on the conversation happily says to me, I think there's something else you need to know about Ship Island. I'm certain this woman was a librarian because she was like sent from the heaven. I mean, she was an angel. And she told me about the Native Guards. And I went straight to the Gulfport Public Library to find, what I could in there. And the first thing that I found in the Gulfport Public Library was somebody's MA thesis that had a mention of the Native Guards. And that's when I started looking for monographs and then going to the archives in Washington to find out about the Native Guards, because I wanted to write about that erased history, that forgotten story. And that has continued to be, both on a personal and a national level, something that I've wanted to do as a writer.
I just want to say, as a historian, I appreciate the archival research that goes into writing these incredible works. In that sense, and especially in relation to all of this, then it seems to me that the act of reclamation, of reclaiming these stories, is in itself an act of resistance. At one point you say the historical erasure of black people in the larger landscape of American cultural memory is a given, a distortion of our shared history. And that was for me an invitation to write into the absence in the record an act of redress. Does that ring true to you, that the two work hand in hand?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, I remember when I was working on Native Guard, I met this book collector at Emory University where I was teaching. Now, this was an educated man, and he was a lover of books. He had, his name was Raymond Danowski. He collected the sort of largest privately collected archive of poetry in English, which he donated to Emory University. And at that time, he said to me, the problem with black people is that they've never had to fight for their own freedom. Now think about this. This is an educated person, but it's not that crazy that he would say it because, as the historian Eric Foner pointed out, of the hundreds of monuments, Civil War monuments, North and South, only a handful even mention the participation of black soldiers at all. So it's no wonder that people going to school and reading that slaves were happier and clothed under master's care, and that, there weren't any black soldiers in the war, or they didn't fight for their freedom. No wonder people would think those kinds of things. No wonder, because it's everywhere. And so I feel like I lost track of the question when I went off on that. I think I'm saying, what am I saying?
This idea that reclamation and resistance go hand in hand.
Yes, right. Yeah. By reclaiming those stories, we are
your mother's
resisting
story,
the
your
existing
grandmother's
narratives.
story, your story, the Native Guard story. It's all part of that same project.
Yes.
There's also a beautiful part here where in a wonderful metaphor, you compare writing to the craftsmanship of your grandmother's sewing, and you talk at length about the process of writing. And you say that translates to me now as a way to think about syntax, about order and chaos. How one writes is inseparable from why one does. Can you explain what you're talking about there?
I had a friend who used to say, another poet, that clarity is revolutionary. I am a poet who is very much interested in clarity and precision. I don't want to obfuscate anything. And for me, the reason is that I am trying to communicate something very precise and specific, and I don't want the accidents of misinterpretation. I want to do as much as I can to make it such that the reader knows what it is I'm trying to say. And so, in terms of precision of imagery, precision of syntax, because I'm also trying to, in poetry, correct the historical record. Robert Hayden wrote because one of the reasons that he wrote was to correct the misapprehensions of African American history. Because I'm trying to do that, I cannot afford to be unclear.
There's also something I think very powerful about being here specific, and talk about place. And I don't mean the Mississippi Book Festival, but I mean in the Mississippi State Capitol, in this room. But also, I look in this room and I see a really incredible crossroads because I see the incomparable Alice Clark hanging on the wall, the first black woman elected to the Mississippi legislature, who served for 40 plus years, representing Jackson State University in our area. I'm wondering, and I do want to just, if you have some questions, we'll have a little bit of time for some good people in the audience to ask a question or two. Please be thinking about questions. I really love Q&A when it includes questions. But back to this notion of this place and where we are, this room, this building, being a Mississippian. Is there something about identity as Mississippians that means something? Is there something unique to it? Or is it just one part of the universal experience of being human beings and the experience of place?
I mean, as a Mississippian, of course I think that there's something unique about, Mississippi. I think it is a kind of crucible, I'm thinking about the line from this lovely poem. I can't think of the poet, but the line is, "We are all Mississippians," and that means here and beyond Mississippi, because I think as a crucible, so much of who we are as Americans gets played out in a place like this. I've sat on many panels with other white writers who, the question will be about Southern writers. And the question, someone in the audience will always say, so why do you think that Southern writers write the way they do? And almost always, someone on the panel will say, well, after all, we lost the war. And I always have to say, my South didn't lose the war. And that, when you, I think that there's something about being a Mississippian, wanting both to deal with our complex, difficult, terrible, beautiful history. It is terrible, but it's also mine. And it is also the place that made me, the place that I love. I can't imagine being the writer and the person I am without the trauma of losing my mother, but also the trauma of being born in Mississippi on Confederate Memorial Day when it was still illegal. It is the thing that has made me a writer. In his memoriam to William Butler Yeats, W.H. Auden wrote, "Mad Ireland hurt you into poetry. Mad Mississippi hurt me into poetry."
I'm so glad you said that about Mississippi and the Civil War. If we understand that the majority of Mississippians at the end of the Civil War were black, we won the Civil War, right? It's such a great point. If you walk into the COFO Civil Rights Education Center in Jackson State, which was the headquarters for Freedom Summer 60 years ago this summer, there's a wonderful quote by the great Bob Moses. When you're in Mississippi, the rest of America doesn't seem real, and when you're in the rest of America, Mississippi doesn't seem real. And that feels like maybe a point of departure for us here. Any last things you want to share, or before we open it up for some questions from the audience?
I just want to say thank you to you for doing so much work and these really thoughtful questions. I mean, can we just applaud Robbie Luckett? 'Cause
I take that as a very deep compliment, Natasha. Thank you very much. Questions from the audience? We have one right back here in the hat. Yes.
So, there are certain politicians in the state who try to gain traction by arguing for slashes to humanities budgets and state universities, et cetera. One of them is actually speaking here today, which I think is a great example of unintended irony. Anyway, so what would be your response, like your succinct response to those kinds of calls, like for we need maybe more professional programs, we need less of the humanities? And this whole session is going to respond to that succinctly.
So a few people up front couldn't hear. Essentially, the question is, what is your response to politicians who are making waves calling for slashes in budgets to the humanities and to the arts, and what is the response to that?
yes, well, he also said, and thank you for saying that basically this whole discussion has been an answer to that, but I guess I would just go back to the ability to tell one's own story, that only through the study of the humanities do we learn the stories of other people, the way that they connect us to our own, and help us figure out ways to tell our own, so that we are not simply the pawns of dictators and authoritarian people with authoritarian impulses who would rather just train us than educate us.
Seeley.
Returning to your earlier question about how difficult it is, the craftsmanship that it needs to turn the professional, the personal, into well-crafted art. I've taught in an advanced poetry class 2 of your poems about the death of your mother, one being a ghazal and one being a sonnet. So can you talk a little bit about, as a poet, about how form impacts subject and how subject impacts form in saying something different in a new way about that topic?
So the question, as a poet, how form impacts subject and how subject impacts form.
Yes, so well, let me answer it also by thinking about the crossroads again, because you mentioned a sonnet, Celia. I'm not sure which one you're thinking. I'm wondering if it was Graveyard Blues. Yes. Okay, so I was hoping that was one of them. So Graveyard Blues is a blues sonnet, and so it formally has the characteristics of both of those forms. And I think that it comes together because of thinking about that crossroads, being able to sort of use the classical sonnet form to do something with the vernacular. The poem is about the day we buried my mother, leaving my grandmother's house, going to the church right across the street, and then getting in that hearse and going to the graveyard. There's no way that poem could have simply been a sonnet. It had to be a blues sonnet because it was also rooted in that place.
Right here.
Do you think Kamala Harris has read your book, House of Because she does a wonderful defense of using the vernacular, the code switching in her talks. And so it's so close to what you've said. I just think she must have read it.
Well,
If you didn't hear that in the back, she wants to know if she thinks Kamala Harris has read this book.
but tell them why. why,
Because of the link between the vernacular and
the vernacular and code switching. I'm glad you brought that up too, because as someone who can and does code switch, I mean, even coming back to Mississippi and sounding a little bit more Southern than I do when I'm, in the Midwest, is a kind of code switching. And so for someone to say, why did she sound black over here and then something else over here, really, I mean, it's just a way to try to defame somebody's character rather than to say, it's one of the ways that we connect with each other, right? That's why we sound like each other when we talk to each other. Why wouldn't you find a different language when you were trying to convey a different thing?
Communication, yeah.
Yeah.
That's great. Thank you guys for being here today. Let's have a round of applause for the